Okay, so can you tell me what you were doing before the?
Well, I'd like to make it clear that I'm not a historian. I am a metallurgist, a kind of engineer, and I just got interested in the history of my profession. I spent 15 years in industry before I turned academic, and I think this was an extremely interesting time for me because it gave me some practical feeling of what technology was about, and this I think is essential for understanding what records there are of technology generally. So much has been written about technology by people who don't have any feel in their fingers of what it's about. History cannot be reconstructed on the basis of verbal records. It's got to be reconstructed on the basis of the interpretation of things. And that is something which only somebody who has been rather intimately involved in the making and shaping of things can understand. I got a degree in metallurgy, first at the University of Birmingham in England. Then I came to this country as a graduate student at MIT. And like most fresh doctors, I wanted to get an academic job, but in 1927 there were none available. So I went to industry, somewhat reluctantly, but in retrospect it was the best thing that could possibly have happened. And I spent 15 years working on in fact, I was the research laboratory at the American Brass Company in Waterbury, Connecticut, and did a great deal of work on the constitution and properties of copper alloys, and got involved in the use of copper as an alloy of steel, and generally was fairly much at the forefront of metallurgical research at that time. It was metallurgy, though. It was not in any way a pure science. It was this a level where one talks about atoms but doesn't really use them in one's explanation of the properties of things. A thing which I think is very important is as a result of my time in industry, and incidentally, as a kid at home, I had my own laboratory at home and spent an immense amount of time just handling substances. And I had a little foundry in my home too, casting all kinds of things. And for the first 30 years of my life, it was essentially a practical experience with the way materials behave and the marvelous diversity of the properties of different substances, and then finding out how you can change the properties of materials by certain treatments. You alloy copper with zinc or with tin and get brass or bronze with their different properties. You hot work them or cold work them or do various treatments, all of which are changing the substructure of the material, the microstructure, the relationship of the atoms to each other, and always, if it's interesting, developing an imperfect structure as a result of changing the environment and making the material respond to an environmental change. And someone who works with materials practically gets a feeling, and it's a muscular feeling, quite as much as it is an intellectual one, for the behavior of materials. You begin to feel a close really an intimacy with different kinds of materials, in much the same way that you develop a feeling of understanding and intimacy with other human beings. It's something that you can't put in words exactly, yet it affects your reaction with the world enormously. More so, I think, than actual intellectual understanding, which is always partial and never complete. You see, what I've been driven by for a long time is the relationship between what can roughly boil down to the human's experience of the world from an aesthetic point of view, and his experience from a practical, controlled, scientific view. It's this marvelous property of human beings of being able to be interested in things at different levels of structure. I mean, when you look at a work of art, your first feeling is how interesting it is. When you want to look at it closer, and you see more and more detail. But of course, the response is due to this marvelous interaction between different levels of structure. You see things more closely. You hear things. You relate what you hear to what you see, and above all, I think this is part of the human experience, which is usually glossed over by scholars who try to write about these things, and that is the muscular interaction of the whole body to the world. I think the senses are not only the eyes and ears and with their fine discrimination, or even touch with its fine discrimination, but a kind of muscular involvement of the whole body. It's the kind of thing that comes out in a dance.
What did you learn in working for the industry? You say that it was very important before going to the academy, to the university.
One thing I learned was that one's theories had to be checked in practice, and one's theories which suggested that something might work usually turned out not to work. I was also, of course, in a number of cases, I developed some ideas about alloys which might be useful, and then I went out into the casting shop and watched the transition between a laboratory scale experiment and an industrial scale operation, and the two are quite different. And then, of course, I also got a sense of, the purpose of industry, after all, is to do something which society wants and is willing to pay for, and this means both the opportunities and the restraints of working in industry, which are very different, and they effect on what you do and think about from working in the laboratory. I'm very intrigued with the interaction between the different kind of human temperament and the way these different approaches are so very necessary in order to end up with any real understanding. I mean, if you read the Greek philosophers, you see that what Aristotle, for instance, describes the nature of matter, the nature of substance, and he explains it in terms of the earth, air, fire, and water idea of Empedocles. What he's really doing is seeing that materials have different degrees of plasticity and hardness, different degrees of meltability and so on, and he was playing around with knowledge which he got directly from observing men working in the workshop and dealing with metals and ceramic and wood and fabric and so on. And he was trying to put that in a philosophical framework. It begins with the interaction of human beings with materials. Then you can move to this level of trying to explain it philosophically, which eventually became scientifically. Can you use that?
Sure.
I don't.
I think sure. I mean, you don't have to worry about it. It's a beautiful, right? It's really very, very interesting. Can you tell me something about the relationship between? I mean, since we have been working with the industry, and then you have been also working at Los Alamos for the making of the bomb. which one is the relationship between science and technology? What do you think about it?
I think that until very recently, and roughly in the middle of my own lifetime, that science came directly out of technology, and it was of no use to the technologist. The discoveries of the technologist, the discoveries of the craftsman about the properties of matter and so on, and mechanism, are always preceded anything you can call scientific knowledge. I think there was a very interesting period in the 19th century where it became possible for an engineer to use an equation to kind of extrapolate the behavior of structures. It was mathematics. It wasn't science. It was a purely empirical kind of matching of the behavior of real things with mathematics. It completely ignored the substructure of materials. And I think the big change that's happened lately has been that with a proper understanding of substructure and the real structure with all of its imperfections, you can begin to get ways of developing new materials. This is beginning to be science, which is opening the way to new technology, but it's a very recent thing. I mean, consider all of the the development of steel, for instance, which was made very, very early, made by craftsmen, finding how that if you heat something under certain conditions, if you heat iron ore under certain conditions, you will get one kind of metal, and another under other conditions you'll get a different material, but without any theory at all, simply the knowledge from experience of what you must do in order to make use of the nature of the material. The first science in metallurgy comes about. Well, there are really two branches. I mean, one is the development of the chemical understanding of things, which begins in the 16th century pretty much, and leads to analytical chemistry, which comes straight out of metallurgy. And then the other is the understanding of the structure of things. At the end of the 18th century, the role of carbon, this essential element in turning iron into steel, was discovered for the first time. Think of it. People had been making good steel, good cast iron for about 2,000 years without having any idea that carbon was involved. And then it was discovered because some European was interested in this magical quality of the Damascus sword, something coming from the Orient. The Orient has always had a greater, craftsmen in the Orient have always had a greater understanding of, sympathy for the structure of materials, the complex structure of the Damascus sword with its mixed hard and soft constituents, something utterly unknown in Europe. And in trying to understand this, somebody, a practical metallurgist, first noticed that the slightly dark and the difference in color, the light and dark layers, depended on something that you could extract with acid, and that this was a plumbago-like material. In other words, the graphite carbon. That's the first hint in 1774 of carbon in steel. This was picked up very quickly by that superb Swedish chemist Torbjörn Bergman, and it became a quantitative means of understanding the difference between different kinds of steel in terms of composition. Now there was another thread that had to come out of it, and this also came directly out of practice, not theory, and that is the structure that is related to composition and treatment. And this also has a background in the Damascus sword, in being studied by European science, and the recognition of the importance of the texture, and then a marvelous influence from outer space, the structure of meteorites, and realizing that this particular structure of some meteorites is a very coarse crystalline structure of segregation of iron and nickel in these things. And this was known because you can see this with the naked eye. These same structures were seen by a wonderful Sheffield really not a professional scientist, but just somebody who was curious. These delightful characters in the 19th century who had enough freedom so that they could explore things that they wanted. Henry Sorby knew about etching as it was used in making plates for printing, as it was used for decorating metal. He also knew about this curious effect of meteorites and where etching developed a crystal structure. Then he started looking at local Sheffield steel and saw with great excitement, which he records in his diary, which I had the great fun of finding, discover the Widmer-Stettin structure, that's the structure of meteorites, in Lowmore iron. And he saw the importance of the structure that could be seen with a microscope, and then not much happened for 20 years. It's remarkable how long it takes for something to happen, for something to take on. 20 years later, a German railroad engineer started looking at microstructure of steel, and from that point on, all metallurgy swung increasingly away from the chemical approach toward the structural approach, which so characterizes the material sciences today. It comes from human curiosity. It's not an extension of human knowledge into something. It's really seeing something that is beyond what you know, and it's a search beyond the fringes of knowledge, which drives both the scientist and the person and the engineer. You know, the role of play in this. I mean, it's taking a very long view of metallurgy, which is the only part of history of technology I'm really familiar with. You see that all of the techniques that became practical in the 19th century had their background in the making of jewelry or sculpture. There's virtually no exception to this. The casting, work hardening, alloying, coloring, different ways of shaping things to look nicer. In the course of this, you develop techniques which a different kind of person can use for a different kind of purpose. And this is where you move from somebody who knows how to do something up to a social influence. I mean, unless something is in the first place noticed by somebody else and then replicated, so that it can be done at will, and unless society somehow wants this particular technique to be developed. There can be all kinds of gorgeous techniques which remain unused. But at some point, society will decide that it wants to do something, shall we say, useful, like killing people, with these techniques which were developed simply for making beautiful jewelry or sculpture. The decision as to what to do is always a social decision. The discovery of what can be done is always an intimately individual discovery. Some one curious person finding something which hadn't been known before.
So how do you apply this point of view about on the bomb?
The discovery of radioactivity came about because Becquerel in the 1880s was interested in this curious fluorescence that uranium glass has. Uranium had been used for coloring glass and glaze for a very long time, He just found purely empirically that certain minerals produce an interesting colour. And uranium glass has a very curious fluorescence. Light seems to come all from the inside of the glass rather than just reflected from the surface. And he was interested in this. And when X-rays were discovered and the fluorescence of some minerals, Becquerel started playing around with uranium. And in the course of time, he found that there was some curious radiation coming out of the material. This led to the whole development of radioactivity, the idea that atoms were not permanent, and then the various ways of changing this. And then discovery of fission, the realization that there can be vast amounts of energy coming out of this effect, which had first simply been noticed because it had interesting aesthetic qualities in glazes. A marvelous sequence of things without the slightest indication of what was going to where it was going to end up with. But then, of course, once there is fission, once there was some understanding of this by the scientific by scientific experiment and theory, and this wonderful interaction between theory and experiment, then it becomes possible for society to use this property of uranium in the way that that previously society had been using the property of steel and brass and bronze and all of the other things. Society decided, in the stress of warfare, that this should be developed as a weapon. And it was.
Mm-hmm. So why did you decide to join the Manhattan Project?
I mentioned earlier that I spent many years in industry, getting some practical experience with the way metals worked. Then, during the war, I was asked to join the staff of the War Metallurgy Committee in Washington, which was supervising metallurgical research. I spent almost a year in Washington and hated it. I mean, I was away from the laboratory, not doing anything myself. And then, when Los Alamos was being formed, Joe Kennedy, who was one of the discoverers of plutonium, was looking for people to staff the laboratory. He'd heard something about my work in metallurgical circles, and asked me if I'd be willing to join it. I would have taken almost any job that took me out of Washington. It was sheer luck that I connected with the Los Alamos project. But anyway, I went there right at the beginning with the conference in March 1943, and spent 3 extraordinarily interesting years there.
Did you know from the beginning that it was for making a bomb?
Oh yes. Well, no, not when I said I would join the project. I simply knew it was some important contribution supposedly to winning the war. But as soon as I went to Los Alamos, of course, as everybody else there, I knew the whole purpose. And in Los Alamos, essentially all of the qualified scientists had some knowledge of what everybody else was doing there. There were the weekly colloquia where the various group leaders talked about what they were doing, and Oppie insisted that there could not be secrecy within the project. And of course, I've often wondered as to why I thought so little about the purpose of the bomb when I was at Los Alamos. I decided to go there because with Hitler at large, it seemed that almost anything that would put an end to his machinations would be worthwhile. It was a very desperate situation, I think, and it seemed right and proper at that time to to do the best one could in the way of developing better weapons. I made that decision when I went to Los Alamos, and then essentially got so involved in the science and technology of it that I didn't really re-examine the purpose until after the test at Alamogordo. And I think I'm not untypical on that. The work was very exciting. The association with some of the greatest scientists in the world, the ability, the inspiration of the mountains in the background of Los Alamos, the almost weekly hikes through these mountains with people like Fermi and Beta and Teller and so on. And it's really a gorgeous experience. If only one could get an atmosphere, something like that, doing something that would be good. You know, here's another point, and this touches very much on the social responsibility of scientists, I think.
Can you stop?
Aspetta che torni carico, se no di nuovo.
Come cominci? Alex, quando siamo larghi e lui va avanti molto senza i miei interventi, ogni tanto cambia.
Sono stato più sul primo piano che sull'altro.
Okay.
Perché
Comunque non troppo stretto il primo piano.
Ok, possiamo andare, che succede? È partito? Quando vuoi entrare?
Okay, so you were saying something about the social responsibility of this.
I think that on the whole, a scientist or an intellectual like an artist has got to be essentially selfish in what he does. He does what he thinks is important from his viewpoint. Occasionally, I have usually done what I wanted without much concern with anything other than worrying about one aspect of nature or another. But once in my life, I was a good citizen and did what society wanted me to do. That was working on the damn bomb. That was society's responsibility, not mine, I think. There's always a point, you see, of what is done with something. Now, to be sure that unless something exists, you can't do anything with it. But the decision of using it is always a social question. And here again, the analogy with the structure of metals comes in. I mean, you have certain kinds of atoms which can be put in a different environment to get different crystal structures and therefore different properties of the material. And I think society somehow learns to sort out those things which meet in some curious way an almost unspecified social balance of diversity within the boundary of a given society. I think that one thing which certainly happened after the war was that practically all of the scientists who had been involved at Los Alamos and some in Chicago and somewhat fewer in Oak Ridge, they all got together to see that the public knew what this new weapon meant. And there was a period when virtually all of us felt very responsible for educating the public as to what it meant. But that is quite different from feeling that we were responsible for the use that the society had made.
Did you have any discussion altogether? I mean, the people working at Los Alamos before the decision of dropping the bomb?
You should read my wife's book on that, A Peril and a Hope. She discusses a great deal about the development of the scientists' political and activism. But to come to Los Alamos, there were no public discussions general discussions on this subject. In fact, they were slightly discouraged by Oppenheimer. and I think at the time this was necessary. At Chicago, where the search for what to do had reached its culmination somewhat earlier. There was more discussion of this kind, and people like James Franck, for instance, were very much concerned and organized discussions on the use of both the bomb and the use of nuclear energy after the war. Los Alamos, not very much. My wife is the expert on.
But that's because of security reasons.
In my own case, I think it was nothing more or less than I was so extremely involved with the work in the laboratory and the extreme difficulty and interest of the problem of understanding the nature of plutonium and how to shape it into the bomb part. In other words, the work itself was so fascinating that I didn't pay much attention thinking about the consequences until after the test. The week between the Alamogordo test and the use of the bomb in Hiroshima, a little more than a week, was a terrible period, because we really began. I really began to realize what I'd been working on, but I hadn't bothered much about it during the war. I think I should have, of course, but one doesn't do what one should have in retrospect.
Well, let me ask you something. From one point of view, you are telling me that from an intellectual point of view, it was a great experience.
Yes.
Okay, because it was a bunch of unbelievable people, very intelligent people working together.
Yeah.
It was a team, a working team of probably the best people in the country from in this field.
Yeah.
Right?
In the world.
Yeah, in the world. So it was a challenge.
Yeah.
Probably it was a beautiful atmosphere.
Yeah.
Okay? Then you are also saying that you only later on you realize what you have been working for. Okay. At the same time, you are telling me that the decision, it's always society that make a decision.
Yeah.
Okay. That well, you are part of the society, and all the people who are working down there,
Yeah.
they were part of the society.
Yeah.
Okay. So
No,
what do you think
but
about
it's a question of what level of society you're talking about. I mean, one is always more intimately connected with a few things, with a few people, and you get in wider and wider circles, and the decision to go after this, of course, was a decision of the President of the United States, with all of the governmental input at his level. I mean, that is the level at which the decision to go after this bomb was made. The possibility of doing it, of course, developed in the laboratory, and suggestions for its use moved up, but the decision was that of the government of the United States. And at that level, what did the scientist do? He, in the atmosphere of the war, did what he thought he could do.
But do you still believe this today, that a scientist, doing research, for instance, in genetics or on biology, that he doesn't have any responsibility, social responsibility?
He has a responsibility to see that people know what can be done with knowledge, with the knowledge that he uncovers. I think if you only work on those things, if you work toward an objective, well, I mean, take the case of the bomb. it came about as a result of people's curiosity, without the slightest concern of there being a source of energy in this. At some point, this was decided that by the government that this should be developed. But the work that was used in making the bomb came out of scientific curiosity. It did not come out of any purpose. Look, if you are desperately in need of doing something, you don't fool around playing with pretty colors in uranium glass. You make use of what knowledge there is to achieve the purpose which has been decided on. In other words, you just don't do research for curiosity's sake when you have a definite objective in mind. Yet the possibility of reaching various objectives arises in earlier stages where people are simply curious in the nature of the world. I mean how could in any 17th century scientist have the slightest knowledge of what was going to be done with his work in the 20th century? How responsible are the people who develop methods of mineralogical prospecting, of analyzing minerals and so on, and finding the wonderful diversity of atoms? I mean, that's intellectual curiosity, and it provides the bricks, if you like, from which somebody can build a prison or a temple.
Well, I agree with you about curiosity, okay? But I'm trying just to understand myself, okay? But this group of people, these brilliant people, the best of all the world, they get together, knowing in advance.
Knowing what they were doing then, I agree. Yeah.
Building a prison, as you say, not a temple. They were building, as you mentioned earlier, something to kill as much people as it was possible at the time.
Yeah.
So, don't you think that in this case, since the beginning, these people already have a kind of a social responsibility, or not?
Society somehow decided that it wanted to try and settle its problems with war. I think it is very necessary to remember the atmosphere that existed at that time with the threat of Nazism. And society had accepted the idea that you would kill people in order to promote your particular view of the world. I think that the job of a scientist as such is to try to understand the world. I think that he certainly is responsible for pointing out what he can imagine could be done with with his findings and with his theoretical and practical knowledge. But he cannot really, in the nature of things, have any idea of all of the things that could be done with his knowledge, because what can be done depends upon the interaction of so many different branches of knowledge, and it's so highly interactive and completely unpredictable.
Well, let me ask you something else. I mean, I agree with you, and probably I would, if I had brain enough at that time, I would be working against Germany, against the Nazis, okay, building this terrible weapon in order to stop Hitler, okay? But before the bomb was dropped, Germany was already out of business, and now we are getting information coming from everywhere that there were no need, to drop the bomb on the Japan, on Hiroshima. Okay? So, did did you discuss this problem in this short period of time? And why Oppenheimer was not willing to have discussion about the bomb and the use of the bomb? Well, if I can ask you something like this, I mean, you don't have to answer, of course.
Yeah.
I mean,
The scene, of course, was made in Washington.
mhm.
There was a great deal of input from the scientists on what they wanted. There was a strong movement to have a demonstration of the bomb, you know. But I mean, I remember so clearly the morning after the test at Alamogordo, driving back to Los Alamos, within about 3 miles of the crater, this beautiful little celadon bowl in the earth, a shallow dish, a beautiful green color. That wouldn't tell anybody what had happened. I really think the bomb had to be used in order for people to get some sense of what it meant. In other words, an intellectual knowledge of this is not the same as emotional knowledge.
So, if I understand, you just told me that the bomb should be used in order to understand what it was all about.
I'm saying that if the bomb had not been used in anger, that the politicians of the world would not have had any concept of what they're up against. In other words, the theory of it is enormously impressive, but the feeling of what it means is what the general public, including politicians, depend on.
There were.
I might say that I think the second bomb, the one in Nagasaki, there was no excuse whatever for using that. I think that was really criminal. But again, that was a political decision, not a scientific one.
Can you tell me something about the security rules in Los Alamos?
There was within the laboratory there were very few security rules at all. One talked with anybody if one had some scientific reason for talking with him. It was not highly compartmentalized in that way. Of course, one had to be very careful about not leaving classified papers around. One always cleaned up one's desk carefully and locked everything at night. but Oppenheimer insisted that you couldn't carry out a project of this kind if all of the different operations were strongly compartmentalized.
So do you remember anything about the discussion about scientists being in uniform? I mean, being militarized?
There was a little of that the early days, but Oppie insisted that the militarization of the project would delay it, and of course his viewpoint won out over that of the army. Although I must say, General Groves was remarkably understanding of the necessity of moving away from a military environment on all things.
Can you tell me something about General Groves? I mean, what kind of person was he?
Well, he was certainly a driver. Most of the scientists at Los Alamos didn't like him. They thought he was interfering too much. But with my industrial background, I was a little more tolerant of the necessity of a little bit of management from up above. He was not a person that one would get personally very fond of, but one, in retrospect at least, can't help but admire how he handled this enormous project so well.
Well, since you had a very long experience with industry, okay? Because you told me you have been working for many
I was in the research laboratory of industry. I was not actually on the production side.
Well, I don't know. I have a feeling, okay? Well, I will try to ask you. Did the army, I mean the military, left an imprint, a footprint on society, after the Second World War? Because of this huge mobilization and this big changeover and the war effort of all the corporation and each sector of society and so on?
Well, I think one of the main things that happened was the interaction between the army and industry, the thing which Eisenhower was so worried about, the military-industrial complex. I think that was a very real result of the coordination that occurred during the war. I think as far as the general public is concerned, I don't think there was very much change. I mean, the role of the army in America it's never been quite as prominent as in most other countries. Which is not saying that beneath the surface it isn't very much there.
What's your point of view about the relationship between war and technology, science and war? I mean, let's say war, technology, and war and science.
I think on the whole that war results in the development of any technology that is ready for development, but it actually hinders the development of new of really new discoveries and theoretical insights. I mean, that again is the question whether if you place all your efforts toward doing something which you know you want to do, you will turn your mind away from those things which don't relate, and the things that don't relate that will determine what the long-range future will be. And it's these discoverers of somebody who is dissatisfied with things as they are, rather than somebody who wants to use things as they are for some visible purpose, either his own selfishness, his own profit, or some socially determined goal.
What about the idea of progress?
Of
Do you remember the idea of progress? Do you remember we have been discussing this at the workshop last month? Yeah. What do you think about?
There is change. How do you know whether it's progress or not? I mean, one thing is, I think, quite evident that that there will always be change, and the development of one thing means the destruction of something else. And how do you decide what is best on what scale? I mean, you can decide what is best for yourself selfishly, and you'll sometimes be right. You can decide what is best for your family. You can decide for a short time what might be best for your state. But in the long run, how do you know? You can't.
Do you believe that technology is pushing, society toward progress, or is technology by itself means progress?
I don't think so. I think technology offers opportunities for society to do something or other, and if you do one thing which you might locally regard as being desirable, you are not doing something else. I mean, it's always a question of balance, and within some boundary, there's when you do something which seems good, you're also doing something which seems bad from a different viewpoint. I mean, again, it's a question of viewpoint. Are you looking at things from inside or from outside? And they obviously both the view and the interpretation of the view and any value that you choose to put on it will change sign across a boundary. I think it's so essential to try and see things in terms of a kind of a hierarchical structural interaction, a series of boundaries where things which are different find temporary local reconciliation, but having done this, they've set up a structure which must be in conflict with some other.
Io c'ho la parte sotto, perché avendo ovviamente un rettangolo, giusto? O ti serve tutto quanto anche il sopra?
Non lo so quello che lui vuole dire poi su questo, comunque.
This is a photograph of a raft of very tiny soap bubbles, all the same size, about 0.2 of a millimeter in diameter. They simply aggregate together into these uniform areas where they're all oriented in relation to each other in the same way. But if it starts in one area at one angle and another area at a slightly different angle, although the structure is identical internally, there's bound to be this boundary of conflict between the two. And you can look at this on a micro level, on a somewhat larger level, and then on a still larger level, and find how things which are quite different at one level, quite similar at another, and then they get different, and then they get similar again. You must look at everything in terms of the hierarchy of interacting structures, and this goes both in space and in time. And the analogy with this, which is simply orientation of the array of these soap bubbles, which is very much like a political orientation. I mean, you can be perfectly happy in a group of people who think the same way that you do, but you won't know what you're talking about until you come up against some other society which is seeing the same thing from a different direction. And it's a question of the scale of uniformity and the scale of disuniformity. And the analogy of structure in space and structure in time, I think, is really very, very interesting. You can change these soap bubbles by introducing a bubble of a different size, and put enough of these together, and they will aggregate to form an entirely new structure, a new philosophy, if you like. But I would like to introduce into this, though, something about rather specific about the development of the techniques that I've been particularly interested in. I mean, I mentioned earlier the great role of jewelry and sculpture in discovering the properties of matter. And then you move up to development of dyes, and all of chemistry comes out of this. It doesn't come out of theory. It comes out of people looking for interesting properties of matter. And then even in the 19th century, you get such marvelous things as the development of reinforced concrete, which is so important in building these days, developed by a French gardener who wanted a somewhat bigger pot for a more magnificent display. It wasn't developed for making bigger buildings. And then think of all of the really elaborate building technologies themselves in the building of cathedrals, not in building useful space. The development of the whole electrical power industry comes out of an attempt to use a new discovery from the scientific laboratory for copying works of art. And the first electrical generator had nothing to do with power production. It was simply producing electricity for doing thick electroplating in the making of sculpture by electrolysis. And of course, once the technique existed, then it was used by somebody else for a more socially useful purpose. And any number of cases of this, and of course it goes right back in history. The agriculture had its prehistory in the growing of flowers, and people play around growing with flowers, and without realizing for a time the relationship between this and the food supply, and which they wouldn't fool with because they didn't want to interfere with it. But you discover things by this quality of essentially aesthetic play, and that underlies all change. This non-purposeful curiosity about what would happen if.
Well, I understand your point of view about curiosity. Let me ask you, switch back again to the period of the war. Okay, people usually they think about the bomb like something that has been built by a small group of people, okay? Few people getting together and deciding to make this unbelievable weapon. In reality, it was
an enormous industrial enterprise.
Can you say something about this? Can you explain that it was not only the product of a small
yeah,
group
of course.
people?
I mean, it's usually thought that it was built. The bomb was built by physicists.
We have to change. Okay, and that's I think it's an interesting question. It's very important. Okay, can you tell me something about this?
Well, it is usually thought that physicists built the bomb, but certainly it came out of physical knowledge in the first place. But the building of the bomb needed an enormous industrial operation. The huge plant at Oak Ridge, the huge plant at Hanford, producing uranium-235 and plutonium, respectively. These were industrial operations, not scientific ones. But they were made possible by the scientific knowledge which had developed, which showed what might be done, and they'd become necessary at that time because of social decision. It's very curious how people simplify what happened. You have to simplify things in order to understand them at all. But had one tried to get across to the public the whole complexity of the Manhattan Project, that they would not have been interested. I mean, how can you be interested in those men who dig ditches, who build walls, who put roofs on buildings, who fabricate some machinery, who weld things together. All of this is absolutely essential. It's an organization, the complexity of which is matched only by a biological organism such as the human body. And in fact, it's even an aggregate of this level of complexity. But you can't understand complex things except via a kind of aesthetic sense of the way that the whole thing fit together, without being able to follow detailed connections throughout the entire structure. The DuPont company did a remarkably good job, I think, in developing from the laboratory experiments up to the actual production, production factories, and it was all done under secret conditions. Remarkable. I was one of the first founding members of the History of Technology Society, and I've noticed with considerable interest the way in which the field has changed over the last 40 years or so. The history of technology wasn't part of conventional history until ever so recently. I mean, it was just historians were interested in a quite different level of society. But gradually they began to realize that the social change was made possible by, if not caused by, technical development. And then in the late 40s, a number of people began to look at the history of technology per se and emphasize at first the actual experience of the engineer in developing a certain type of matter or mechanism. But then gradually, as the history of technology became more and more accepted as part of history, the center of gravity is moved so strongly towards social history. Both the History of Science Society and the Society for the History of Technology are now mainly concerned with social history. They move so strongly away from the experience of the scientist or the technologist who provides the nucleus for the higher level. I think this is a little regrettable, except that I do know that everything changes. There are fashions for emphasizing one level of structure or another, and there's this glorious alternation throughout history on practically everything. I would like to see more attempt to understand the individual technologist and have a little less emphasis on the part of historians of technology, not of course on the part of general historians, on the social level. You need atoms in order to have human beings, and you must understand a little bit about the behavior of atoms in order to understand the behavior of human beings. And the human being is much more dependent upon the atom than the atom is upon the human being. So. Okay.